G'day everybody, how are you going today? It is so good to see you. I am shooting and the sun is directly behind the camera, although it's just gone behind a cloud. So please, you must excuse my hair. I've got helmet hair. I've been riding all day since about 12 o'clock, and it's now 7 o'clock, 7:07 to be precise. And I've been shooting, not the whole time, but as the light got more interesting from sort of 4 o'clock onwards with these two here. Now, firstly, I have to give a super big thanks to Blonde Robot, the distributor for Tamron in Australia. They have been so kind as to let me borrow these two lenses together at the same time, so I can, and I think this is the first time ever in my life and ever in the life of my channel that I've tested two lenses that are the same, from the same manufacturer, but on different mounts. And I actually think this is a really important moment, because this is as close as we get to being able to dispel some myths. And not that I'm trying to dispel any particular myth. A 90mm lens from Sony and a 90mm lens from Nikon, I got that around the wrong way. A 90mm lens from Nikon, a 90mm lens from Sony, they are going to be different. They make lenses differently. Their formulas are different, their coatings are different, their manufacturing, it's different. Now, they might do things very similarly. I don't know how much they may copy or share technology, no idea. But this is a third party who really, by all accounts, doesn't have a dog in any particular game. Even so, yes, Sony have a 15% share in Tamron. Just if you didn't know that, they do. Now, look, some people have said, oh, that means Tamron will never do good things for Nikon and they'll always be, you know, that usual echo chamber stuff. And speaking of echo chambers, I just thought I would ask ChatGPT, what did it think of the anti-Nikon Sony perpetuated echo chamber? It came back with a few answers, and here they are. Pause if you'd like to read. Just a bit of fun. I think the fact that these two lenses coming out at the same time has got to dispel some of that. I just think it simply means that Nikon inked contracts with Tamron, I don't know, let's say 3 years ago, because I think we've had 2 years of lenses, and it just takes that long for it all to catch up. Plus, this was an example of where Nikon said, yeah, all good. Let's do a 90 of the Tamron. Sony does have a 15% share in Tamron. Last time I looked, 15% was not a controlling interest of anything. There's a whole other 85%, and they would need 36% more to have 51%. I think this partially dispels the myth. I think we basically got, maybe for the first time ever, maybe at the same time, a Z mount lens and an E mount lens. I think this is a unique moment, a first moment, and I'm surprised that no one else has talked about it. And if I'm wrong about that, getting a Z mount and an E mount lens at the same time, if I'm wrong about that, please do let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to talk about that lens. There might be some Chinese lenses that have done that. I've never been able to get hold of two of them. I've actually started to talk to some of the Chinese lens makers about them giving me two different mount lenses, because I think it'd be really interesting for the channel and for people watching, because they were just really interested in that. Like, oh, does it really make a difference if I'm using this on E mount or L mount, R mount or Z mount, and so on, all the different full frame mounts. Is Fuji going to do a full frame mount? I've heard rumors, but I don't know. These are macro lenses, but they don't have to be shot as macro lenses. They're really good lenses. I've already got thoughts, which I look forward to sharing more of, and the sun's just come out to blind me. It's a first for this channel, and it may well be a first for a high quality third party, one of the major two manufacturers, Sigma or Tamron. I think this is a first, that the same lens at the same time. And look, it's just great. It's great for business. It's great for Nikon that they're getting the same things at the same time as Sony. That's got to send a message to the industry as well. And all the pundits out there who, oh my God, they say so many things. I would have thought that optically, lens elements, coatings, focus motors, everything in these two lenses for Z and for E mount are identical. Also, obviously, the actual construction of the lens is slightly different. The Z mount one is slightly longer because the mount is much closer to the sensor. The E mount one the mount is much smaller because the E-mount is significantly smaller, almost a centimetre, which is something around 1/3 to 1/2 inch smaller. So that means the lenses are physically different. They actually have different weights. Does that make any difference to anything? My answer is probably not. The lens is designed for a 35mm sensor, which is a certain distance from the back element, and you can obviously ensure that it's the correct distance by making the lens longer and shorter. So in real terms, the lens should perform absolutely the same. And this is where it's really interesting to me, because then what comes into play is we've got things like in-body image stabilization, and I can already see that the Z8's in-body image stabilization works better than the stabilization in the A7R. Just with, as the movements get larger, the Z8 holds on for longer. That's improving the lens without it having anything to do with the lens. It's to do with the body. One of these cameras is the A7R5, so it is 60 megapixels, and the other one's 45 megapixels. It sounds like a big difference, but it's only actually just over 1,000 pixels difference on the long edge. Real terms, we're talking about 8,200 off the top of my head versus about 9,500 or 9,400, so somewhere in that vicinity. And if you think of that as a percentage, it's like 12 or 13% difference. For almost all use cases, that's just never going to read, and it's only if you're making big prints. And I can tell you, I've made big prints that are over 2 meters, over 6 feet, from 12 megapixels. And when you're talking about sensors that are this good as the Z8 and as good as the A7R5, and if you're shooting at base ISO, which I am today, you've got beautiful files coming out, which means you can start to look at doing AI enlargements. Ultimately, what I'm saying there is the difference in sensor size is pretty negligible. As I said, it's 12 or 13%, and then add in AI, and this is very specific to landscape or streetscape or street photography, where we're not talking fast photography, we're slowing down, we can use these lower ISOs, we're not worried about rolling shutter because these sensors are very different when it comes to rolling shutter, and yet I'm really keen to see the difference. And then the other thing to think about, especially with landscape photographers, a lot of landscape photographers like to shoot at f8, f11, f16 because they think getting everything in focus is the answer, which I don't necessarily think it's the only answer. I think there's a lot to be said for deliberately choosing to create depth with shorter depth of field, but that's okay. That's just the art of photography, and that's the joy of photography. We all do things differently. But of course, a 60 megapixel sensor, which we have in the A7R5, diffraction starts to become a conversation at that point. With the Z8 and its 45, you're probably still sitting on the edge of diffraction becoming a conversation. Diffraction is a loss of quality above a certain f-stop point. So it's really interesting to me that I have the same lens. It should theoretically be identical, and I've got an opportunity to put these cameras side by side. Now, I've already taken maybe 50 shots on the tripod, also handheld, as meticulously as possible, and I'm doing it handheld by having the focus point always set to the center. I've got a grid set up, and I'm choosing the same spot in the scene, and that's how I line it up, obviously getting everything level and so on. I'm doing my very best. There was also a bit of variable lighting earlier, but it's been more consistent of late this afternoon to get the same frame. And what will be of real interest to me, is there any difference when you take all of this into account? And then of course there's sensor technology and how the color filters and how they're designed that sit on the sensors, and then the color science, which is how you interpret the zeros and ones that are coming off that sensor. They are completely different with the two companies. So again, there's no right or wrong. There's no camera company that's better or worse as such. It's just science, and some might be more pleasing and less pleasing, and of course pleasing is subjective. They're different. Exactly the same glass, but actually quite a lot of differences. So I'm really interested to see the outcomes of this. We will look at the images now in Capture One. The next step will be some printing. And my dear friend Bruce, who has been lending me his A7R5 for a couple of months now, Bruce, thank you very kindly. It means a lot to me and it means a lot to the channel. He is going to help me do some printing, and we're going to do maybe 1 meter or larger. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll go as far as 2 meter prints, one of our favorites from this shoot, and see, is there any real world difference? Now, I've shot at 2.8, at 3.2, and at f11. And if there's not a shot that I think is worth going that large with, just simply to show everybody what the outcome is, I will kindly ask Blonde Robot again if I can borrow these lenses. But it's really interesting. It's really interesting for so many reasons. I've spent a long time looking at these files, trying to understand what it is I'm seeing. Just to be very clear, we have the Sony on the top. On the Nikon, we are shooting at 45 megapixels in high efficiency star, and on the Sony, we are at 60 megapixels shooting in raw lossless compressed. This is potentially a big difference. I want to also point out with this particular image we are shooting at f11, so there is the potential for diffraction to be influencing the sharpness that we're seeing here, but I want to just forewarn that we are seeing, I think, basically the Z8 is looking sharper. It's hard to believe, pixel for pixel, than the Sony a7RV. Both cameras are in their diffraction zones at this point in time. As we saw before, it potentially starts with an aperture of 7.1 for Sony and potentially starts at f9 for Nikon. Diffraction is a whole science unto itself. There's a lot to understand there. There is the Sony image in all its glory. It looks fantastic. This is a 32-inch 4K screen. Not all of this will translate on YouTube, but you'll get a fair understanding of it. Nikon Z8 image, and in real terms, is there a difference between the two? It doesn't really feel like it. Nikon is on the right. Even on a screen at this size, at 100%, it's not that easy to see and tell the difference between them. And hopefully this translates on YouTube, but just look at this area here and have a look at which you think is sharpest. The exposure of these images should be very, very close, with the Sony being just slightly darker. The Sony is 100 ISO and the Nikon is 64 ISO, so you have to adjust the shutter in order to try and match the exposure, because I'm wanting to keep the apertures the same, so we have the same level of sharpness. Which feels sharper, which looks cleaner? I am very surprised to say that the Z8 actually looks sharper. This might be something to do with the high efficiency star compression, which is fine because it doesn't look like there is any resolution or anything that has been lost either. Just keep in mind we are looking at 200%. Each pixel of the image is now being represented by a 2x2 cluster of the screen. This is still a very clean pixel for pixel sort of look. I'm just trying to make it as obvious as possible, and it definitely does not look as sharp. High efficiency star is a compressed raw file, I believe, but you might be saying, well, how are we going for dynamic range? In the shadow area, which was almost dark when our exposure compensation was at 0, I don't really feel like there's any loss of detail. You're looking through all of these individual windows, all of this information here. It looks like it's all there, along with the fact that the Nikon looks a little bit sharper. Let's not forget we're looking at structures that are something like half a mile, almost a kilometer away, and we're shooting at f11. Everything should be in focus. And now, is this about diffraction? It might be about diffraction. This is an example of how the Z8 seems to be performing similarly to the Sony a7RV. At this sort of megapixels, when we take into account AI enlargements, where it's very easy to just double either of these, at which point you've either got a 16,500 pixel wide image or a 19,000 pixel wide image. And thus what I mean by that is making it larger, it's not an issue for either of them, and you can make them significantly larger. And how it feels to me that there is more grain in the Sony image. Sony on the left. Just a reminder, we're sitting at 200% on both files, and there seems to be more grain. Now, something that I was thinking about is that the pixel pitch of the A7RV is something like 3.7, and the pixel pitch of the Z8 is 4.2 or 4.3. There is significantly more light gathering area for the Z8. And what that means is potentially more amplification needs to be applied to the Sony in order to get it to a similar point. And amplification means noise, and noise can also mean noise reduction, and noise reduction can potentially mean a softening of the image. This is pre-AI noise reduction being within a camera and being applied to a raw file before it's being exported. And I think the very first camera that we're seeing or starting to play with that idea is the two new Canon cameras with their AI noise reduction built in for export, I think of just JPEGs only at this point in time. There are so many factors that go into play the differences between these sensors. We've obviously got the sensor size, the pixel pitch, the color array, the micro lenses, and then perhaps the glass that is on the sensor that goes between the sensor and the outside world. And then we also have the color science and just raw technology, how it is that they interpret the data that comes off the sensor to turn it into what we see today. Part of that is known as the color science. So we've got, what, 5, 6, 7 different factors that all are being leveraged off each other to give you what we're seeing here today. And let's be realistic, the difference between these two are minor, almost irrelevant. So there's no fails here. There's nothing dramatic going on here. I'm not going to talk about drama, but what I am going to talk about is the fact that I'm surprised that the Nikon Z8, which is 45 versus the 60 megapixels, is holding up so well. In this particular shot, in this particular example, in this particular use case. Now, this may not be applicable in every one. What I'm showing you here is what's happening here today. What's so exciting about this particular round of tests is we are able to use the same lens. But of course, lenses are physically made also, and well, there may well be differences in lenses. That is another factor. But we have to take in good faith that these two lenses are up to a certain standard. Handheld, I don't think I got the focus spot on, but why I wanted to show you this one again is because I've pushed the files so hard. They're both at half a second and they're both at 2.8, and they both look great. Now you can see the settings are the same and they're both at half a second. So the Nikon file should be a little bit darker, and we can see through here it probably is a little bit darker. But both of them are doing an absolutely outstanding job. And in this file, just for the sake of looking at dynamic range, I have pulled the highlights as hard as I can down and the shadows as far as I can up. These files look extraordinarily similar. Again, in this particular case, it does appear that the Nikon is sharper, which kind of almost doesn't make sense. And again, I just think it's to do with sensor technology, the glass arrays, the micro lenses, and exactly how is it that they are managing the data and creating their raw files. Because these are two very, very extraordinarily similar outcomes, very similar colors, very similar results. ISO 100 1/60th, 1/160th on the Sony, and we're at ISO 64 1/100th on the Nikon. And if we zoom in to the building and we get to 100%, there's 100 there, and there's 100 there. If you look closely through this area here and through this area here, I just get the sense of it being cleaner and slightly sharper. This might not be applicable in all use cases, but it's well worth understanding that this is the result between a 60 megapixel camera and a 45 megapixel camera, with a camera that has a very slow sensor versus a camera that's sensor is so fast that it does not have a mechanical shutter. Very, very different cameras, yet in this particular use case, the results are not indistinguishable. Well, I think they would be. If they weren't side by side, I reckon at this point, someone would be extraordinarily hard pressed to tell you which camera is which. And again, I do think the Nikon might just be a little bit sharper. We're now 200% with each camera, and just look at how these lines are rendered through here on the building versus what the Nikon does, and again, how it's dealing with these flat areas, and there just seems to be a little bit more noise. Is that because the sensor has photo sites that are, I think it was around 15% less area, so it has to be amplified more? Is that the issue? You can see here that the noise in the Nikon is definitely lower here than it is here. That is a quite obvious difference between those two files. I don't know. This is what I'm getting. This is what I'm seeing. I've tried to make everything match as much as possible, and to the point of using the same lens from the same manufacturer, which is quite a rare opportunity, which feels sharper to you? We are at 1/100th and 1/160th of a second. Both have IBIS. I don't believe camera shake is coming into play. And of course, we've seen how effective both of these cameras' IBISs are, and they are very effective. That's 200%. I'll let you call it for yourself. In this case, the Sony is actually darker because we have an ISO 100 1/4000th and ISO 64 1/2000th. Can't really see it. It's not that obvious. Let's get into 100% pixel for pixel. I feel like the Nikon is just rendering this a little bit sharper. And then if we bring up, Z8 on the bottom is slightly crisper, and there's not as much grain or texture in the windows. Again, I just think the files look so similar and sharper in inverted commas. I feel like the Z8 looks sharper. Now, is it over sharpened? Well, maybe, although I'm not sure you can really say that when you're looking at an image at 200%. I think you might make that sort of statement maybe at 100%, and when we're at 100%, I can't make that statement. I don't feel it's giving me those vibes. Now, let's just keep in mind both files have been pushed 4 stops, and both are looking outstanding, and both have tons of information there. Focus point was in the same place again. These files are deliberately being pushed 4 stops, as well as highlights and shadows, just to show the dynamic range of the sensors and how well the sensors are hanging together. Of course, we are at base ISO, so this is a base ISO use case. Next time I do this, I will play with some other ISOs. Making these videos is very detailed, and there's just a limit to what you can achieve. You know, I'll leave it up to you to decide which Keller looks sharper, which Liebherr looks sharper, which Alfazi looks sharper. These files are identical, and there's just a few seconds between them. Dynamic range appears to be very, very similar. To me, this says a little bit about looking at charts and numbers versus just real world usage. From a dynamic range perspective, are we seeing one camera really failing against the other? And the answer is absolutely not. These files are impossible really to tell the difference when you're looking at this sort of level. At 100%, basically the same. And if they weren't side by side, you would have no idea. Ultimately, to recap the findings in real world usage, real terms, if you are doing an exhibition, if you are doing posters, if you're photographing for a book, an enormous array of use cases, these two cameras are imperceptibly different. And we are seeing here potentially examples of where the Z8 appears to be sharper. Now, of course, the A7R does have more pixels, but as we saw, when it comes to AI enlargements, you get great results just doing a 2 times on any image in AI today. And thus, both of these images become so large that any use case required is now being serviced. And ultimately, that also comes to an APS-C crop, because I can hear people saying, yeah, but the Sony has a bigger APS-C crop. Sure, but 5,000 pixels becomes 10,000, and 6,000 pixels becomes 12,000 pixels. And again, in pretty much anyone's language and in pretty much any use case, this is simply more pixels than anyone needs. And the use cases that are so small, so rare, and I won't say unique, but there's probably not that many of them, that are going to shoot these cameras, then shoot them in APS-C, then decide the 19.4 or 26 odd megapixels, the difference between the two of them, is not enough for their needs, then can blow it up 2 times with AI, then have over 10,000 pixels on the long edge, and either of those outcomes not being enough. So essentially what we're saying here is, for an enormous array of use cases, these cameras are essentially the same. Now, the compelling thing about the Z8 is, well, these two cameras are the same price. The Z8 has an electronic shutter. It can shoot 1/8000th, but it can also shoot up to 1/32,000th of a second. And it has no shutter, which means it has a shutter shield instead of a shutter. It also means that those ultra high speeds, rolling shutter is not a thing. So then this camera not only can be used for great landscapes, as we can see here, but we know it can be used for action and wildlife, and it can be silent. But it also can be at a wedding or in any other event where perhaps quiet, for instance, I worked for the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra for almost 10 years, and quiet, silent, was something that's essential. Be able to have this level of quality and be able to shoot at whatever shutter speed I want to and not have to worry about making a sound. Ultimately, it's pretty clear to me that in the Z9, and even more compellingly in the Z8, Nikon has made the absolute ultimate all-rounder. And if you think about in Sony's range that they've created, I'm not going to call it a niche, but it's certainly aimed at a particular user of camera. And Sony in the A7R has made a camera that is for high megapixel users. But at the end, in these use cases, I think we've shown there really isn't much difference between them. Why not go for the ultimate all-rounder instead of going for the camera that keeps you in more of a niche? Look, it's a really interesting question. I don't ultimately mind which way you go, but I know what I would do. And this is us not even talking about the differences in video spec, which are very different between the two cameras. The Sony does 8K, but with I think around a 20% crop, makes the 8K with anything that's moving about as fast as the average bicycle, starts to display rolling shutter with something moving that slow. The Sony can't be used for action in video, and it maxes out at 1/8000th of a second in mechanical shutter. So if you have to revert to the electronic shutter, or you need to be silent, so you have to revert to the electronic shutter, you can't shoot action with it. So these are just things to think about. Another thing that I think a lot of users lean into is in-body image stabilization, and you see this more in video than stills, because I think in stills they both perform pretty similarly, but in video it's quite clear because you're shooting frame after frame and they all need to be steady, that the Z8, it just hangs on longer when it comes to IBIS. Having this opportunity to use exactly the same lens, and we're looking at it here, exactly the same lens, left and right, different cameras. I've tried to make the color science and everything as the same as possible. And I gotta say, if I didn't know these were two different cameras, well, I don't think any of us would know. I really think in real terms, image quality wise, there's nothing in it. I'll end this by saying if I can get these two lenses again, as well as, thank you Bruce, the Sony a7R5 again, I will do more testing. All right, everybody, well there it was. That's the outcome. Really interesting stuff. I'd love, the sun's just setting here behind me. I'd love to know your thoughts about all of what we just saw there. I think it says there's no bad choices. But the Z8 and Z9, this is the sensor that we're talking about, is an extraordinarily powerful platform because it does give you the capacity to do what we've done today, but it's also a high-speed camera. It's also a video powerhouse. They're just very, very powerful all-rounders. And when we start to think about the use cases that might make an A7R5 more appealing, these two cameras and the real world outcomes as opposed to counting pixels, I think we can see here, there's really not a lot in it. And Bruce, which I'm going to get Bruce on the channel, he's just bought the ACR, which is the ridiculously compact version of this camera. From the perspective of this sort of photography, slow moving, landscape, etc. photography, same outcome, much cheaper. It's like $3,500 in this country. It's an extraordinary amount of camera, but I'm going to let Bruce tell you about that in an upcoming video. And for me, it's not really that different to say a Z7 or a Z7 II in the sense of image quality. And we're talking about streetscapes, landscapes, cityscapes, and so on. It's all really compelling. All right, everybody, before the wind, because I'm down here near the bay, and I'm in a bit of a wind tunnel, before it actually knocks over, even so I'm on a tripod, this whole setup here, and we're losing the light. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again, so please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now. Sorry about the light, it changed.